In this chapter, we will look at the sociological perspectives on race and ethnicity. After this chapter, you will be able to explain the functionalist perspective regarding racial and ethnic inequality, explain the views of conflict theory, and also identify the views of interactionism regarding racial and ethnic inequality. Let's begin with the functionalist perspective and the view they have on race and ethnicity. Anthropologist Manning Nash has identified 3 functions that racially prejudiced beliefs have for the dominant group. Racist views provide a moral justification for maintaining an unequal society that routinely deprives a subordinate group of its rights and privileges. Racist belief discourage members of the subordinate group from attempting to question their lower status, which would be to question the very foundation of society. And racial myth encourage support for the existing order by introducing the argument that any major societal change, so for example the end of discrimination, would only bring greater poverty to the subordinate group and lower the dominant group's standard of living. Viewing immigration from a functionalist perspective, it is argued that immigration performs valuable functions. It alleviates labor shortages in the receiving society. Migration can relieve the economies in the sending nations that are unable to support a large number of people, for example, via remittance, which is sent by immigrants to their home countries, and they are very significant. And even so, functionalists argue that racial prejudice and discrimination may serve the interest of the powerful. They do admit that racism is also associated with dysfunction, and Rose identified the following dysfunctions associated with racism. Society that practices discrimination fails to use resources of all its individuals. Discrimination aggravates social problems. Society must invest a lot of time and money to defend the barriers to full participation of all members. And racial prejudice and discrimination undercut goodwill and diplomatic relations between nations. How about the dysfunctions of immigration? What would a functionalist theorist say? They would argue that areas that accept high concentrations of immigrants may face difficulties in meeting short-term social service needs, and also the absence of citizens with skills or educational potential can be dysfunctional for developing countries. When we look at race and ethnicity from a conflict perspective, some sociologists have used exploitation theory, which is also called the Marxist class theory, to explain the basis of racial subordination in the United States. So from a Marxist point of view, racism keeps members of subordinate groups in low-paying jobs, thereby supplying the capitalist ruling class with a pool of cheap labor. Workers from the dominant group who demand higher wages can be replaced by those from the subordinate group who accept low-paying jobs. Examining race and ethnicity through the labeling perspective, which is also part of the conflict perspective, racial profiling may be defined as any arbitrary action initiated by an authority based on race, ethnicity, and national origin rather than one's personal behavior, and skin color became a key characteristic of criminal profiles beginning in the 1980s with the emergence of the crack cocaine market. And authorities continue to rely on racial profiling despite overwhelming evidence that it's actually misleading. So how does a conflict perspective look specifically on immigration? Well, they argue that white ethnics and racial minorities have been antagonistic toward one another because of economic competition. And conflict theorists note how much of the debate over immigration is phrased in economic terms. The debate intensifies when the arrival are of different racial and ethnic backgrounds from the host population. For example, the movement to keep Chinese immigrants out of the United States became a lot more fervent during the later half of the 19th century when Chinese and whites fought over dwindling work opportunities. And lastly, how do interactionist theorists look at race and ethnicity? They came up with the contact hypothesis that states that interracial contact between people of equal status who are engaged in a cooperative task will cause them to become less prejudiced and to abandon previous stereotypes. And another way of reducing racial and ethnic stereotyping and prejudice may be the establishment of interracial coalitions. This idea was suggested by sociologist William Julius Wilson. To work, such coalitions would obviously need to be built on an equal role for all members. If you have any questions or need help with any of the material, please email me anytime. I'm here to help.